What would you do if you found someone society had thrown away, broken and abandoned, believing they were worthless? Thomas McKinnon thought he knew loneliness until the day he discovered that sometimes the most beautiful souls come wrapped in the most unexpected forms. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Oklahoma wind carried dust and regret across the McKinnon Ranch that scorching July morning in 1887. Thomas McKinnon stood on his weathered porch, squinting through the heat shimmer that rose from the red earth like ghosts of better days. At 43, he'd grown accustomed to silence, the kind that settles deep in a man's bones when he's buried too. Many dreams and not enough hope. His ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of stubborn prairie, dotted with mesquite and the skeletal remains of cattle that hadn't survived the brutal summer. The well hadn't run dry yet, but Thomas could taste the coming drought in every gust of wind. More troubling than the weather, though, was the emptiness that had taken root in his chest since Martha's death 3 winters past. Martha McKinnon had been the melody in his otherwise monotone existence. She'd filled their modest ranch house with laughter, fresh bread, and the kind of warmth that made even the harshest Oklahoma winters bearable. When pneumonia claimed her, it took more than just his wife. It stole the music from his world, leaving behind only the hollow echo of a man going through the motions of living. Thomas adjusted his worn Stetson and stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching against the parched grass. He'd planned to check the northern fence line today, where wild mustangs had been testing the boundaries of his property. But as he saddled his horse, a peculiar sound drifted across the prairie, something that didn't belong to the usual symphony of cicadas and meadowlar. It was weeping. Soft, broken, and unmistakably human. He paused, one foot in the stirrup, and listened. The sound came again, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the ridge that separated his land from the Comanche reservation. Thomas had lived on this border for 15 years, maintaining a respectful distance from the tribal lands, while occasionally trading horses with the few Comanche who ventured near his property. But this crying wasn't coming from the reservation. It was closer, much closer. Mounting his horse, Thomas rode toward the sound, following it like a man drawn to a distant lighthouse in a storm. The weeping grew clearer as he crested the ridge, and what he saw in the valley below stopped him cold. Near a dried creek bed, beneath the meager shade of a dying cottonwood, sat a figure that defied his immediate comprehension. It was a woman, but unlike any he'd ever encountered. She was massive, easily 500 pounds or more, with long black hair that hung like a curtain around her broad shoulders. Her dress, once probably blue calico, was now faded and torn, clinging to her enormous frame in patches. But it wasn't her size that struck Thomas most forcefully. It was her complete and utter abandonment. She sat alone in the middle of nowhere, miles from any settlement, with no horse, no wagon, no supplies, nothing but the clothes on her back and a despair so profound it seemed to radiate from her like heat from sun-baked stone. Her massive hands covered her face as sobs shook her entire body, each one seeming to echo across the empty prairie. Thomas dismounted and approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. As he drew closer, he could see she was native American Comanche, by the traditional beadwork on her torn dress and the turquoise bracelets that adorned her thick wrists. Her skin was copper brown, weathered by sun and hardship, and when she finally looked up at his approach, her eyes held a depth of pain that made his own grief seem small by comparison. She couldn't have been more than 25, despite her size and the weariness etched into her features. Her face, round and full, bore the unmistakable beauty of her people, high cheekbones, strong brow, and eyes the color of rich earth after rain. But those eyes now held a brokenness that spoke of betrayal so complete it had shattered something fundamental inside her. "Ma'am," Thomas said gently, removing his hat and holding it respectfully at his side. "Are you hurt?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he was real or just another cruel trick of the desert sun. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from crying and thick with an accent that blended English with her native tongue. "You should not stop," she said, her words careful and measured. "I am nothing now, less than nothing." Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the defeated tone of her voice. He'd heard that same hopelessness in his own voice during the darkest days after Martha's death, when he'd questioned whether there was any point in continuing to draw breath. "Nobody's nothing," he replied, though even as he said it, he wondered if he truly believed it about himself. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if even her name was something she wasn't sure she deserved to keep. "Ayanna," she finally whispered. "Ayanna Crowfeather. I'm Thomas McKinnon. This is my land you're on, but you're welcome to it. What happened to you, Miss Crowfeather? How did you come to be out here alone?" Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head as if the story was too painful to tell. But slowly, haltingly, the words began to come. Her English was better than many of the Comanche he'd encountered, suggesting she'd spent time in mission schools or among white settlers. "My husband," she began, then stopped, the words seeming to catch in her throat like a bone. "My husband. He brought me here in his wagon. Said he was taking me to visit my sister on the reservation. But when we got to this place, he told me to get out. Said he could not bear to look at me anymore. Said I was too much food, too much space, too much shame." Thomas felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and immediate. "He left you here? In the middle of nowhere?" Ayanna nodded, her massive frame shaking with silent sobs. "He said I was killing his horses with my weight. Killing his reputation. That people laughed when they saw me with him, and he was tired of being married to a whale." The cruelty of it hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd known men to be heartless before, but to abandon a woman, any woman, alone in the wilderness, was an act of such callous evil that it made his hands clench into fists. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "2 days," she whispered. "Maybe 3. The sun has gone down twice since he drove away. 2 days without food or water in the Oklahoma heat." Thomas looked at her more carefully and could see the signs of dehydration in her sunken eyes, and the way her skin had lost its elasticity. Despite her size, she was clearly suffering from exposure and dehydration. "We need to get you some water," he said, reaching for his canteen, "and food. When did you last eat?" She looked at him with such surprise that he might have offered her the moon. You would share your water with me?" The question hit him harder than her tears had. What kind of treatment had she endured that a simple act of human decency seemed like a miracle? "Of course I would," he said, uncapping the canteen and holding it out to her. "Here, drink slow, or you'll make yourself sick." She took the canteen with trembling hands, and he noticed how carefully she held it, as if afraid her touch might somehow contaminate it. She sipped delicately, despite what must have been a raging thirst, and handed it back to him half empty. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in her voice, a note of wonder, as if kindness was a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Thomas studied her face as she wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her massive hand. Even marked by pain and abandonment, there was a dignity about her that spoke to something deeper than appearances. Her movements, despite her size, held a natural grace, and her voice carried the musical cadence common to her people. Most importantly, her eyes, now that some of the immediate despair had lifted, showed an intelligence and warmth that drew him in despite himself. "Miss Crowfeather," he said, settling down on a nearby rock so their conversation wouldn't seem so one-sided. "I've got a ranch about a mile from here. It's not much, but it's got walls and a roof and plenty of food. You're welcome to stay until you figure out what you want to do next." She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. You would take me to your home? I would, but you do not know me. You do not know what kind of woman I am. Thomas considered this, looking into her dark eyes and seeing not the massive body that society would judge, but the soul of someone who'd been broken by cruelty and was struggling to believe that kindness still existed in the world. I know you're a woman who's been hurt, he said finally. I know you're alone and need help. That's enough for me to know. For the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered across her features. It was fragile and uncertain, like a candle flame in a strong wind, but it was there. Why? She asked, and the single word carried the weight of a lifetime. Of rejection and abandonment. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Martha and the loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years. Thinking of all the times he'd sat in his empty house, wondering if this was all life had left to offer him, just the slow passage of days until he joined his wife in whatever came after. Because, he said finally, maybe we both need to remember what it feels like not to be alone. She studied his face with those intelligent eyes, searching for deception or ulterior motives. Finding none, she slowly, carefully began to push herself to her feet. Thomas immediately moved to help her, offering his arm for support as she struggled upright. Even standing, she was taller than most women he knew, and her presence filled the space around them with a kind of quiet power. I am very heavy, she warned as they began the slow walk toward his horse. I do not know if your horse can carry. U.S. both. Thomas looked at his sturdy quarter horse, a strong animal bred for ranch work, then back at Ayanna. We'll go slow, he said, and if we need to, I'll walk alongside. As they made their way across the prairie toward his ranch, Thomas found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him. Society would see only her size, only the burden she represented. But he was beginning to see something else, a woman of obvious intelligence and grace who'd been systematically broken down by a world that judged worth by appearance rather than character. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon by the time his ranch house came into view. It was a modest 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch and windows that caught the late afternoon light. Martha had loved those windows, had spent countless hours sitting by them with her sewing or a book. Now, they stared emptily across the prairie, reflecting nothing but sky dot as they approached the house. Thomas realized he was about to cross a threshold he hadn't even known existed. For 3 years, his home had been a shrine to his dead wife and his own grief. No one had entered it except himself and the occasional neighbor bringing news or supplies. Now he was bringing someone new into that space, someone who needed more than just shelter, but healing. It's not much, he said as they reached the porch steps, but it's solid and safe. Ayanna paused at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the house with an expression of such longing that it made Thomas's throat tight. It is beautiful, she said softly. It looks like a home where people were happy. They were, Thomas replied, thinking of Martha's laughter echoing through those rooms. Once upon a time, they were very happy. As he helped Ayanna up the steps, Thomas McKinnon had no idea that he was about to embark on a journey that would transform not just her life, but his own. He didn't know that this massive, abandoned woman would teach him that love wasn't about size or appearance or what others thought. It was about seeing the soul beneath the surface and choosing to nurture it, no matter what form it came wrapped. In all, he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, his house was about to hold more than just memories and silence. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough to begin with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The front door of the McKinnon ranch house hadn't opened for a stranger in over 3 years. Thomas felt the weight of that reality as he turned the brass handle, the familiar creak of hinges seeming to announce that something fundamental was about to change within these walls. Ayanna hesitated at the threshold, her massive frame filling the doorway as she took in the interior of his home. Her dark eyes moved carefully across the front parlor, taking in the handmade furniture, the stone fireplace, and the layer of dust that had settled over everything like a shroud of neglect. But what seemed to capture her attention most was a photograph on the mantelpiece, a tintype of Thomas and a beautiful blonde woman standing together in front of this very house. "Your wife," she said softly, and it wasn't a question. "Martha," Thomas confirmed, following her gaze to the image. "She died 3 winters ago." Ayanna nodded with the understanding of someone who had known loss intimately. She was beautiful. She had kind eyes. Thomas felt something shift in his chest at her words. Most people commented on Martha's physical beauty, her golden hair, her small waist, her delicate features. But Ayanna had seen something deeper in that frozen moment, captured in silver and light. "She did," he agreed. "She had the kindest eyes I ever saw." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with a mutual recognition of grief. Here were 2 people who understood what it meant to have love torn away, leaving behind only empty rooms and hollow hearts. "Please sit," Thomas said, gesturing toward the sturdy sofa that Martha had insisted on when they'd first furnished the house. "It'll hold you just fine." Ayanna moved with surprising grace despite her size, settling carefully onto the sofa, as if testing its limits. The springs creaked but held, and she smoothed her torn dress over her massive thighs with a dignity that spoke of better days when she'd cared about her appearance. Thomas disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a pitcher of water and 2 glasses, along with some leftover cornbread and cold beef from yesterday's meal. He set them on the low table in front of her, noting how her eyes widened at the sight of food. "Please," he said, "eat what you need." She looked at him with those expressive dark eyes, searching his face for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive. Finding none, she reached for a piece of cornbread with hands that trembled slightly. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite while simultaneously trying not to appear too eager. "Tell me about your husband," Thomas said gently as she ate. "What kind of man abandons his wife in the wilderness?" Ayanna's chewing slowed, and she swallowed hard before answering. "His name was Jonathan Hargrove. He was a trader who came to our reservation 2 years ago," he said. She paused, her voice catching. "He said he loved me. Said my size didn't matter to him, that I was beautiful." Thomas could hear the pain in her voice, the echo of words that had once brought joy but now carried only betrayal. "He courted me properly," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Brought gifts to my father, learned some of our customs. My family was suspicious. Why would a white man want to marry a woman like me? But I believed him when he said love had no boundaries. What changed?" Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer would be as ugly as the abandonment itself. Ayanna's massive shoulders sagged. "At first he seemed proud of me. He would take me to town, introduce me to people. But I began to notice things. How conversations stopped when we approached. How children would stare and point. How women would whisper behind their hands." She reached for another piece of cornbread, but her appetite seemed to have diminished. Jonathan started making excuses. Not to go places together. Thought I should stay home more, that it was better for both of us. Then he began commenting on my eating, saying maybe I should try to lose some weight. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He'd known men like this, weak men who cared more about others' opinions than their own hearts. "But the worst part," Ayanna continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "was when he started bringing home stories about what people were saying about us. How they called me his burden. How they said he must be desperate or touched in the head to marry someone like me. Those people were fools," Thomas said with quiet intensity. "Their opinions say more about them than about you." She looked at him with surprise, as if the thought had never occurred to her. In my village, before I married Jonathan, I was respected. I was known for my beadwork, my storytelling, my knowledge of healing plants. But in his world, I became nothing more than my size. Thomas found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story and angry on her behalf. What finally happened? What led to him abandoning you? Ayana's hands clenched in her lap. Last week, we went to a dance in Lawton. I had made a new dress, spent weeks on the beadwork. I felt beautiful for the first time in months. But when we arrived, people stared even more than usual. A group of men started making jokes, calling me Jonathan's whale and asking if he needed a bigger wagon. Her voice broke slightly. Jonathan laughed with them. My own husband laughed at their cruelty and said maybe they had a point about the wagon. Thomas felt a surge of rage so pure it surprised him. To see one's spouse humiliated and join in the humiliation, it was a betrayal so complete it left him speechless. That night, he barely spoke to me. The next morning, he said we were going to visit my sister on the reservation. I was excited. I hadn't seen her in months, but instead, her voice trailed off. Instead, he drove you to the middle of nowhere and left you to die, Thomas finished, his voice hard as iron. He said he couldn't do it anymore. Said looking at me reminded him of every cruel joke, every whispered comment, every pitying look. He said I had destroyed his reputation and his business, and he was done carrying my burden. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Thomas stared at this remarkable woman who had been systematically destroyed by a man who had promised to love and protect her. But what struck him most wasn't her pain, it was her resilience. Despite everything, she was still here, still fighting, still capable of recognizing kindness when it was offered. Ayana, he said finally, your husband was a coward and a fool. A real man doesn't abandon what he's sworn to protect, no matter what others think. She looked at him with such hope in her eyes that it made his chest ache. You truly believe that? I know it, he said firmly. I've seen weak men and strong men, and strength isn't measured by what others think of your choices. It's measured by how you treat those who depend on you. For the first time since he'd found her, Ayana smiled. It was a small thing, tentative and fragile, but it transformed her entire face. Thomas caught a glimpse of the woman she must have been before the world tried to convince her she was worthless, intelligent, graceful, and possessed of a quiet dignity that no amount of cruelty could completely erase. What will you do now? She asked. I mean, I cannot stay here forever. People will talk about you the way they talked about Jonathan. Thomas considered this. She was right, of course. In a small community like theirs, a white rancher taking in an abandoned Comanche woman, especially one of her size, would set tongues wagging from here to Oklahoma City. But as he looked at her, sitting in Martha's favorite spot, he realized something that surprised him. He didn't care. Let them talk, he said. This is my land, my house, my choice. And right now my choice is to offer you a place to heal from what that bastard did to you. But your reputation, my reputation is my concern, not yours, Thomas interrupted gently. Besides, I've been dead to this community for 3 years anyway. At least now I'll be dead for a good reason. Ayana studied his face carefully. You would risk social exile for a woman you barely know? Thomas thought about this question seriously. Why was he willing to take such a risk? Part of it was simple human decency. No one deserved to be abandoned and left to die. But there was something more, something he was only beginning to understand himself. Ayana, he said slowly, for 3 years, I've been living like a ghost in this house. Going through the motions of life without really living. Maybe helping you find your way back to yourself will help me find my way back to mine. She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying the photograph of Martha on the mantelpiece. Your wife would have approved of this, she said finally. What makes you say that? Her eyes, Ayana replied simply. I told you they were. Kind. Kind people recognize kindness in others. That night, Thomas prepared the guest room that had been closed since Martha's death. He aired out the linens, brought in fresh water for washing, and made sure the window opened properly to catch the evening breeze. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the woman downstairs and the courage it must have taken for her to survive 2 days alone in the wilderness. When he returned to the parlor, he found Ayana still sitting exactly where he'd left her, as if afraid to move around his home without permission. The guest room is ready, he said. It's not fancy, but the bed is solid and the mattress is good. She looked at him with wonder. A real bed? With sheets? The question hit him like a physical blow. What kind of life had she been living with her husband that clean sheets and a proper bed seemed like luxury? Real sheets, he confirmed. And tomorrow we'll see about getting you some proper clothes. That dress has seen better days. Ayana looked down at her torn and faded dress, then back up at him. I have no money to pay for clothes, or food, or lodging. I have nothing to offer you in return for your kindness. Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the defeat in her voice. Ayana, kindness isn't a transaction. It's not something you pay back, it's something you pass forward when you're able. As she slowly made her way upstairs, Thomas remained in the parlor, staring at Martha's photograph and wondering what his wife would think of the choice he'd made today. But somehow he knew she would approve. Martha had always been drawn to wounded things, stray cats, injured birds, anyone who needed healing. She would have seen past Ayana's sighs to the wounded soul beneath, just as he was beginning to do. Outside, the Oklahoma night settled over the prairie with its familiar symphony of crickets and wind through the grass. But inside the McKinnon ranch house, something new was beginning to take root. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that two broken people might be able to help each other remember what it felt like to be whole. In the guest room above, Ayana Crowfeather lay in a real bed with clean sheets for the first time in months. And for the first time since her abandonment, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her story wasn't over. Perhaps this white rancher with the kind eyes and the gentle hands might help her remember that she was more than the sum of other people's cruelties. And downstairs, Thomas McKinnon sat by his fireplace and realized that for the first time in 3 years, his house felt like a home again. Dawn broke across the McKinnon ranch with the golden promise of a new day. But it was the sound of singing that pulled Thomas from his restless sleep. Soft, melodic, and hauntingly beautiful. A voice drifted through his bedroom window like morning mist carrying ancient secrets. He dressed quickly and stepped onto the back porch, following the sound to its source. There, in the small garden plot that Martha had once tended with such care, knelt Ayana. Her massive frame was bent over the neglected earth, her hands surprisingly gentle for their size, carefully pulling weeds from around the withered remains of what had once been Martha's pride and joy. The song she hummed was in her native tongue, a low, rhythmic melody that seemed to breathe life back into the forgotten garden. As she worked, Thomas noticed something remarkable. Despite her size, she moved with an intuitive understanding of the plants, knowing instinctively which were weeds and which were dormant flowers waiting for the right care to bloom again. You don't have to do that, Thomas said softly, not wanting to startle her. Ayana looked up, dirt smudged on her cheek, her dark eyes bright with something that hadn't been there yesterday. Purpose. The earth is crying, she said simply. It remembers being loved and misses the touch of caring hands. Thomas felt something catch in his throat. Martha had said almost the exact same thing about her garden, though in different words. She'd claimed that plants could sense love just as surely as people could. My wife used to tend this garden, he said, settling down on the porch steps to watch her work. She said it was her sanctuary. I can feel her spirit here, Ayana replied, her hands continuing their gentle work. The roses remember her touch. See? She pointed to a seemingly dead bush. This one is not gone. It's just sleeping, waiting for someone to believe in it again. As if to prove her point, she carefully cleared the weeds from around the base of the rose bush, revealing new green shoots that Thomas hadn't noticed before. Her touch was reverent, almost ceremonial, as she worked the soil around the emerging life. In my tribe, she continued, we believe that all living things carry the memory of love. This garden carries the memory of a woman who understood that beauty isn't just about appearance. It's about the care you give and the life you nurture. Thomas watched her work, mesmerized by the transformation taking place, not just in the garden, but in Ayanna herself. Yesterday, she had been a broken woman, crushed by abandonment and cruelty. Today, she moved with confidence and grace, her massive hands coaxing life from seemingly dead earth. You know about gardens, he observed. My grandmother taught me, Ayanna said, a smile touching her lips for the first time since he'd known her. She said that women who can make things grow carry a special medicine. We can heal not just plants, but hearts that have forgotten how to bloom. Thomas felt something stir in his chest at her words, not quite hope, but something close to it. For 3 years he'd avoided this garden because seeing its decay reminded him too painfully of his own withered heart. But watching Ayanna work, seeing her find purpose and peace in the act of nurturing, he began to wonder if healing might be possible for both the garden and the gardener. Would you like some help? He asked. Ayanna looked up at him with surprise. You would work alongside me? I think I'd like to learn, Thomas replied, and meant it. For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in comfortable silence, broken only by Ayanna's soft explanations about which plants needed water, which needed pruning, and which simply needed patience. Thomas found himself studying her as she worked, noting how her entire demeanor had changed. The broken, defeated woman from yesterday had been replaced by someone confident and knowledgeable, someone who clearly understood the art of making things grow. Ayanna, he said as they took a break for water, what did you do before you married Jonathan? Her face lit up with pride. I was a healer in my village. My grandmother trained me in the old ways, which plants could cure fever, which could ease pain, which could help broken bones mend faster. I also taught the children about the healing properties of different herbs and how to read the signs in nature. Thomas set down his water glass, intrigued. A healer? Like a doctor? More than that, Ayanna explained, settling back on her heels. In our tradition, healing isn't just about the body. It's about the spirit, the mind, the connection between all living things. A true healer helps restore balance, not just in the person, but in their relationship with the world around them. That's remarkable, Thomas said, and he meant it. He'd never met anyone, man or woman, white or Indian, who spoke about healing with such depth of understanding. When I married Jonathan and left my village, I had to leave that life behind, Ayanna continued, her voice growing sad. He said it was primitive nonsense, that I needed to forget the old ways and learn to be a proper Christian wife. But you cannot tear the medicine out of someone's heart. It's part of who they are. Thomas felt another surge of anger at the absent Jonathan Hargrove. Not only had the man abandoned his wife, but he'd tried to strip away the very essence of who she was. Did you miss it? The healing work? Every day, she whispered. It was like trying to breathe with only half my lungs. I felt useless, purposeless. Jonathan wanted me to spend my days cooking and cleaning and making myself smaller in every way possible. But how can you make your spirit smaller without killing it? As she spoke, Thomas began to understand the full scope of what had been done to this remarkable woman. It wasn't just abandonment, it was the systematic destruction of her identity, her purpose, her very sense of self-worth. No wonder she'd seemed so broken when he'd found her. She hadn't just lost a husband, she'd lost herself. Ayanna, he said carefully, would you consider practicing your healing arts here? On the ranch, her eyes widened. You would allow that? I'd welcome it, Thomas replied. Lord knows this place could use some healing, and not just the garden. They spent the afternoon walking the property together, Ayanna pointing out various plants and explaining their medicinal properties. Thomas was amazed by her knowledge. She could identify dozens of prairie plants and describe their uses with the precision of a trained physician. She showed him which grasses could be made into poultices for wounds, which flowers could ease headaches, and which roots could help with digestive problems. This land is rich with medicine, she told him as they paused near a cluster of purple coneflowers. The earth here is generous, willing to share its gifts with those who know how to ask. As they walked, Thomas noticed something else. Ayanna moved across the prairie with surprising grace and confidence. Away from the judgmental eyes of town folk, freed from the constraints of a husband who'd tried to diminish her, she seemed to expand into her full self, physically taking up space without apology, and intellectually sharing knowledge with obvious passion and expertise. Tell me about your grandmother, Thomas said as they settled on a fallen log to rest. Ayanna's face softened with love and longing. Grandmother Singing Hawk was the most respected healer in our band. She could cure illnesses that white doctors couldn't even name. People would travel for days to seek her help. She taught you everything? She said I had the gift, Ayanna replied, her voice filled with both pride and sadness. From the time I was small, I could sense when plants were ready for harvest, when someone was sick before they even showed symptoms. Grandmother said it was a responsibility as much as a gift, that those who can heal must heal, regardless of the cost to themselves. Thomas thought about this as they walked back toward the house. Here was a woman with genuine skills, real knowledge, that could help people, yet she'd been reduced to nothing more than an object of ridicule because of her size. It struck him as not just cruel, but wasteful, like throwing away a precious medicine because you didn't like the bottle it came in. That evening, as Ayanna prepared supper, Thomas watched her move around the kitchen with the same confident grace she'd shown in the garden. Her massive hands handled delicate tasks with surprising precision, and she seasoned the food with herbs she'd gathered during their afternoon walk. This is excellent, Thomas said as they ate. The venison stew had a complexity of flavors he'd never experienced before, enhanced by the wild herbs Ayanna had added. Food is medicine too, she explained. The right combination of ingredients can heal the body and lift the spirit. Grandmother always said that a good meal prepared with love was the first step in any healing. As they talked, Thomas found himself genuinely enjoying conversation for the first time in years. Ayanna was intelligent, well-spoken, and possessed knowledge about things he'd never considered. She spoke about the interconnectedness of all living things, about reading the signs in nature to predict weather patterns, about the delicate balance required to maintain harmony between human needs and environmental preservation. You're not what I expected, he said honestly. What did you expect? Ayanna asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Someone broken, I suppose. Someone who needed to be taken care of, rather than someone who could take care of others. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Jonathan tried very hard to break me, she said finally. He succeeded in making me forget who I was for a while. But the medicine in my heart, that can't be broken. It can be buried, ignored, denied, but it can't be destroyed. I'm beginning to see that, Thomas replied. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, he realized something had fundamentally shifted in his understanding of the woman upstairs. She wasn't just someone who needed rescue, she was someone with her own power, her own purpose, her own remarkable gifts to offer the world. The question was no longer whether he could help her. It was whether he was worthy of the healing she might bring to his life. In her room, Ayanna sat by the window, looking out over the moonlit prairie. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like herself again. Tomorrow she would continue restoring the garden, continue sharing her knowledge. with this kind man who seemed to see her as more than just her size. Tomorrow she would begin the work of healing, not just the land, but perhaps two wounded hearts that had forgotten what it felt like to bloom. The medicine was still there, still strong, still ready to work its ancient magic on a world that desperately needed healing. 3 weeks had passed since Ayana's arrival at the McKinnon Ranch, and the transformation was undeniable. The garden bloomed with new life. The kitchen carried the aroma of healing herbs drying in bundles, and the house itself seemed to breathe with renewed purpose. But it was the change in Thomas that was most remarkable. He laughed now, genuinely laughed, something that hadn't happened since Martha's death. He was returning from checking the northern pastures when he saw the dust cloud approaching from town. 2 riders moving fast with the urgent purpose of men carrying unwelcome news. Thomas recognized them immediately. Sheriff Bill Morrison and Dr. Eugene Whitfield, the territorial medical examiner. Neither man made social calls. Thomas dismounted at the hitching post as the riders pulled up to his porch. Sheriff Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the cautious eyes of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness, touched his hat brim in greeting. "Afternoon, Thomas," Morrison said, his tone carefully neutral. "We need to have a word with you." Dr. Whitfield, a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, remained mounted, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He kept glancing toward the house as if expecting something dangerous to emerge. "Sheriff, Doctor," Thomas replied, noting the formal way Morrison had used his given name instead of the casual Tom of their previous interactions. "What brings you out this way? We've had some concerns raised about your current living situation," Morrison said carefully, "specifically about the Indian woman you're harboring here." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He'd known this moment would come eventually. Word traveled fast in small communities, especially word about unusual arrangements. "Ayana is my guest," he said evenly. "I wasn't aware that hospitality had become a crime in Oklahoma Territory." Dr. Whitfield finally spoke up, his voice thin and reedy. "Mr. McKinnon, we've received reports that you're harboring a potentially dangerous individual, a woman of unusual size and questionable mental state who was abandoned by her husband for unspecified reasons." Unspecified reasons? Thomas's voice carried a dangerous edge. Her husband abandoned her in the wilderness to die because he was a coward who cared more about gossip than his marriage vows. If that's the kind of man this community considers reasonable, then I'm proud to be unreasonable. Sheriff Morrison held up a placating hand. "Now, Thomas, nobody's questioning your intentions. But there are proper channels for dealing with displaced Indians. The Bureau of Indian Affairs should be notified, and the woman should be returned to the reservation, where she belongs." "She belongs where she chooses to be," Thomas replied firmly, "and she's chosen to be here." Dr. Whitfield adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Mr. McKinnon, I must inform you that we've received concerning reports about this woman's behavior. Claims that she's been practicing primitive medical procedures, possibly endangering lives with folk remedies." Thomas stared at the doctor in disbelief. "Primitive medical procedures?" "Doctor, in the 3 weeks she's been here, Ayana has successfully treated old Pete Henley's chronic gout with willow bark tea, helped Mary Patterson's infant get over a persistent fever with a sage steam treatment, and created a poultice that healed Jim Crawford's infected cut better than anything from your medicine bag." "Those are exactly the kinds of dangerous practices we're concerned about," Whitfield protested. "Untrained individuals administering unregulated treatments could result in serious harm or death. It's a public health concern." "The only public health concern I see," Thomas said coldly, "is a trained doctor who's threatened by a woman who actually knows how to heal people." Before the conversation could escalate further, the front door opened, and Ayana stepped onto the porch. She had been inside, grinding herbs for a tincture, and her hands were still dusted with the pale yellow powder of dried golden seal root. She took in the scene with intelligent eyes, immediately understanding the nature of the visit. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, her voice carrying the dignity that had been slowly returning to her over the past weeks. "I am Ayanna Crowfeather. I understand you wish to speak with me." Dr. Whitfield visibly recoiled at her size, his horse shying slightly as if sensing his discomfort. Sheriff Morrison, to his credit, removed his hat respectfully, though his expression remained stern. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "we've come to discuss your situation here. There are proper procedures for displaced tribal members, and we need to ensure you're where you're supposed to be." Ayanna's expression didn't change, but Thomas could see the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her hands clenched almost imperceptibly at her sides. She had faced this kind of bureaucratic dismissal before. "And where exactly am I supposed to be, Sheriff?" she asked quietly. "Well, the reservation, naturally. With your own people, where you can receive proper care and supervision." "My own people," Ayanna repeated slowly. "Tell me, Sheriff, do you know anything about my people? Do you know that I was trained as a healer by my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother in an unbroken line stretching back generations? Do you know that I can identify and prepare medicines from over 200 different plants? Do you know that I have successfully treated conditions that Dr. Whitfield's modern medicine has failed to cure?" Dr. Whitfield sputtered indignantly. "Now see here, those are dangerous claims. Are they claims, doctor, or are they facts?" Ayanna interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "Would you like to examine Pete Henley's hands and see how his gout has improved? Would you like to speak with Mary Patterson about her baby's fever? Would you like to ask Jim Crawford about his infected wound?" Thomas watched with growing admiration as Ayanna stood her ground against these men who would reduce her to nothing more than a bureaucratic problem to be solved. But he could also see the cost of this confrontation in the subtle tremor in her hands, the way she had to fight to keep her voice steady. "The issue isn't your ... folk remedies," Sheriff Morrison said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "The issue is that you're living here, unchaperoned, with a white man who isn't your husband. It's improper, and it's causing talk." "Ah," Ayanna said, and there was steel in her voice now. "There it is. The real issue isn't my healing practices or my tribal status. The real issue is that a white man has shown kindness to an Indian woman, and that makes people uncomfortable." "That's not," Morrison began, but Ayanna continued. "Sheriff, let me save you some time. I am here by choice. I am contributing to this household and this community through my skills as a healer. I am harming no one and helping many. The only thing I am guilty of is being too large for some people's narrow ideas of what a woman should look like, and too Indian for others' ideas of who deserves basic human dignity." Dr. Whitfield had had enough. "This is preposterous," he snapped. "You're living in sin with this man, practicing medicine without a license, and refusing to return to your proper place. I have half a mind to have you arrested for vagrancy and illegal medical practice." Thomas stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Doctor, if you even think about arresting this woman, you'll have more to worry about than your medical practice." "Is that a threat, Mr. McKinnon?" Dr. Whitfield asked, his voice rising. "It's a promise," Thomas replied calmly. "Ayanna is under my protection. Anyone who wants to harm her will have to go through me first." Sheriff Morrison looked between the two men, recognizing the potential for violence. "Now let's all calm down here. Nobody wants any trouble." "Then don't bring trouble to my door," Thomas said firmly. "Ayanna is my guest for as long as she chooses to stay. She's broken no laws, harmed no one, and improved the lives of everyone she's encountered. If the good people of this territory have a problem with that, they can take it up with me personally." Dr. Whitfield was clearly frustrated by the turn of events. This isn't over, he warned. I'll be reporting this situation to the proper authorities. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Territorial Medical Board, and anyone else who needs to know about this arrangement. You do that, Doctor, Ayanna said calmly. And while you're at it, perhaps you should ask them about the legal precedent for forcing a free citizen to live somewhere against her will. You might be surprised by what you learn. After the men had ridden away, Thomas and Ayanna stood on the porch in silence, watching the dust cloud disappear toward town. The peaceful routine of their past 3 weeks had been shattered, replaced by the stark reminder that the outside world was not ready to accept their unconventional arrangement. I'm sorry, Ayanna said quietly. I've brought trouble to your door. Thomas turned to look at her. This remarkable woman who had just faced down 2 authority figures with more grace and intelligence than they deserved. Ayanna, you didn't bring trouble. You brought healing. The trouble was already here. It's been here for years, festering like an infected wound that nobody wants to treat. They'll be back, she said with certainty. Men like that don't give up when their authority is challenged. Let them come, Thomas replied. We'll face whatever comes together. But even as he said the words, Thomas knew that their peaceful interlude was ending. The storm they'd just weathered was only the beginning. Soon, they would face challenges that would test not only their resolve, but the very foundation of what they were building together. Inside the house, the herbs continued to dry, the garden continued to flourish, and the work of healing continued. But outside, in the wider world, forces were gathering that would demand they fight for the right to exist as they chose. 2 wounded souls who had found in each other the possibility of becoming whole again. The real battle was just beginning. Morning after the unwelcome visit from the sheriff and doctor, Thomas found Ayanna in the garden before dawn, her massive silhouette moving through the rows of vegetables like a gentle giant tending to her children. The moonlight caught the silver threads in her long black hair, and he could hear her humming that same Comanche melody she'd sung on her first morning here, but something was different. Her movements were more deliberate, almost ritualistic. And as Thomas drew closer, he realized she was harvesting specific plants in the pale pre-dawn light. The moon is in the right phase, she explained, without looking up when she sensed his presence. Some medicines are strongest when gathered in darkness, just before the sun awakens the earth. Thomas watched as her skilled hands selected leaves and roots with the precision of a master craftsman. Even in the dim light, she never hesitated, never second-guessed her choices. This was knowledge passed down through generations, wisdom that couldn't be learned from books or medical schools. What are you preparing? He asked, settling on a nearby stump to watch her work. Medicine for courage, she replied, her voice soft but steady, and clarity of mind. I have a feeling we're going to need both. As if summoned by her words, a rider appeared on the horizon just as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky pink and gold. But this wasn't another unwelcome visit from town authorities. This rider was smaller, moving with the fluid grace that marked her as Native American, even from a distance. The young woman who dismounted at their gate was beautiful in the sharp, angular way of the Comanche high cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and the kind of quiet strength that spoke of surviving hardships. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she moved with the confident bearing of someone used to being listened to. Ayanna? The woman called out in accented English. Ayanna Crowfeather? Ayanna's hands stilled over the plants she'd been gathering. Kiona? She whispered, then louder, with joy and disbelief coloring her voice. Kiona Running Bear? The 2 women embraced with the fierce joy of sisters long separated, their words flowing in rapid Comanche as tears streamed down both their faces. Thomas stood back, not wanting to intrude on their reunion, but Ayanna quickly drew him forward. Thomas, this is Kiona Running Bear, my cousin. She was like a sister to me growing up. Ayanna's face was radiant with happiness. Kiona, this is Thomas McKinnon, the man who saved my life. Kiona studied Thomas with eyes that missed nothing, taking in his work-worn hands, his respectful posture, the way he looked at Ayana with something deeper than mere kindness. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear. "The spirits told me to come," she said simply. "I had dreams of my cousin in danger, but also of healing and new beginnings. How did you find me?" Ayana asked. "Word travels on the wind between our people," Kiona replied with a slight smile. "A Comanche healer working miracles on a white man's ranch? Such news finds its way even to the most remote lodges." Over breakfast, Kiona shared news from the reservation that painted a grim picture. Drought had withered the crops, disease had claimed several elders, and the government agents were tightening their control over tribal affairs. But she also brought something more precious than news. She brought remembrance. "Your grandmother's medicine bundle," Kiona said, producing a leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "Before she passed into the spirit world, she told me to keep it safe until you came home. But I see now that home has come to you instead." Ayana accepted the bundle with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears. Thomas watched as she carefully opened it, revealing small pouches of herbs, carved bone implements, and smooth stones that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "She said you would know when it was time to accept your full power as a healer," Kiona continued. "She said the white world would try to diminish you, but that your true strength would emerge when you found someone who saw your spirit rather than your body." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks at the implication, but Ayana was too focused on the sacred items to notice his discomfort. "I thought I had lost this forever when I married Jonathan," she whispered. "I thought I had lost everything." "You lost nothing that belonged to your true self," Kiona said firmly. "You only misplaced it for a while." The three of them spent the morning in the garden, with Kiona helping Ayana establish a proper medicine wheel according to traditional Comanche practices. Thomas found himself drawn into their work, learning about the spiritual significance of different plants and the careful balance required between taking from the earth and giving back to it. "In our tradition," Kiona explained as they worked, "healing is not just about curing sickness. It is about restoring harmony between all parts of a person's life, body, mind, spirit, and community." "That's what she's done for me," Thomas said quietly, surprised by his own words. "Restored harmony to my life." Kiona looked at him with new interest. "And what have you done for her?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I've tried to see her as she truly is, not as the world wanted to make her. That is the greatest gift anyone can give another person," Kiona said with approval. "To be truly seen." As the day progressed, Thomas began to understand the profound change taking place in Ayana. With her cousin's arrival and the return of her grandmother's medicine bundle, she was reconnecting with parts of herself that had been buried under years of abuse and self-doubt. She moved with increased confidence, spoke with greater authority about her healing practices, and seemed to grow more beautiful with each passing hour. But it was during the evening meal that Thomas truly understood the depth of transformation occurring. "I need to tell you both something," Ayana said, setting down her fork and looking directly at Thomas. "Yesterday, when those men came here, they made me remember why I left my healing practice in the first place." Thomas and Kiona waited silently for her to continue. "When I married Jonathan, I thought I could have both worlds, my traditional healing knowledge and a place in white society, but he convinced me that the two couldn't coexist. He said I had to choose between being his wife and being a medicine woman." "You chose love," Kiona said gently. "I chose what I thought was love," Ayana corrected. "But real love doesn't ask you to become less than you are. Real love sees all of you and cherishes all of you." She looked directly at Thomas as she spoke. These last words, and he felt something shift in his chest, something that had been building for weeks but which he'd been afraid to acknowledge. "Ayana," he said carefully, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying that for the first time in years, I feel like myself again. All of myself. The healer, the woman, the human being who deserves love and respect. Her voice grew stronger. And I'm saying that I found both of those things here, in this place, with you. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and danger. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he looked at this remarkable woman who had somehow transformed from a broken refugee into a powerful healer before his very eyes. The men who came yesterday, he said finally, they'll be back. They'll bring others. They won't accept what we're building here. Then we'll fight them, Ayanna said simply. Together. Kiona looked between them with the knowing smile of someone who had watched love bloom despite impossible odds. My grandmother always said that the strongest medicine is made when two hearts beat in harmony. It creates a healing power that can overcome any sickness, any obstacle. Is that what this is? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are our hearts beating in harmony? Ayanna reached across the table and placed her massive hand over his work-roughened one. Listen, she said softly. In the silence that followed, Thomas could indeed hear it, the synchronized rhythm of two hearts that had found their perfect match. It wasn't the desperate, consuming passion of youth, but something deeper and more enduring, the love of two souls who had been broken by life and found in each other the strength to heal. I love you, Thomas said, the words emerging with the inevitability of sunrise. Not despite who you are, but because of who you are, all of who you are. And I love you, Ayanna replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. For seeing me when the world refused to look. For believing in my worth when I had forgotten it myself. Kiona smiled and began to sing softly in Comanche. A blessing song that spoke of new beginnings and the triumph of love over adversity. Outside, the Oklahoma wind carried this sound across the prairie, where it mingled with the songs of night birds and the rustle of growing things. But even as they celebrated this moment of recognition and commitment, all three of them knew that the real test was yet to come. Love declared was one thing. Love defended against a hostile world would be quite another dot in the distance. Lights flickered in the town, where men were already gathering to discuss the Indian problem. On the McKinnon Ranch, Dr. Whitfield had been busy spreading word about the dangerous medicine woman who was corrupting one of their own, and Sheriff Morrison was under pressure to take more decisive action. The storm that had been brewing was about to break with full fury. But for tonight, in the sanctuary of the ranch house where two wounded hearts had found healing, love was enough. Tomorrow, they would discover if love was also strong enough to survive the battle ahead. The first sign of real trouble came 3 days after Kiona's arrival, in the form of a dozen horsemen riding hard across the prairie toward the McKinnon Ranch. Thomas spotted them from the barn loft where he'd been storing hay, their dust cloud rising like a brown smudge against the brilliant blue Oklahoma sky. But these weren't curious neighbors or even hostile townspeople. These riders wore the blue uniforms of the territorial militia, led by a man Thomas recognized with a sinking heart, Captain Marcus Thornfield, a career military officer known for his rigid adherence to regulations and his particular disdain for what he called Indian sympathizers. Ayanna, Kiona, Thomas called as he climbed down from the loft. We have company coming, and it's not the friendly kind. The two women emerged from the house where they'd been preparing tinctures for the winter months ahead. Ayanna took one look at the approaching riders and her face went pale, but her voice remained steady. Military, she said simply. Someone has escalated this beyond local authorities. Kiona's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt, her warrior instincts awakening despite her youth. How do you want to handle this, cousin? With dignity, Ayanna replied firmly. And truth. We've done nothing wrong, and we won't act as if we have. Thomas felt a surge of pride at her composure, even as his own anger burned hot at the injustice of what was happening. These people couldn't accept that a white man and a Comanche woman might find happiness together, So they were bringing the full weight of territorial authority to crush something beautiful and healing. Captain Thornfield dismounted with military precision, his steel-gray eyes taking in the scene with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to seeing problems rather than people. He was tall and lean, with the kind of mustache that suggested he spent considerable time grooming it, and his uniform was spotless despite the dusty ride. "Mr. McKinnon," Thornfield said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of military command. "I am Captain Marcus Thornfield of the Oklahoma Territorial Militia. I'm here on official business regarding violations of federal Indian policy and territorial health regulations." "Captain," Thomas replied evenly, not offering his hand or any other gesture of welcome. "What specific violations are you referring to?" Thornfield produced a rolled document from his coat pocket and unfolded it with theatrical precision. "By order of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Territorial Medical Board, you are harboring 2 unregistered Indians engaged in illegal medical practices. Furthermore, you are in violation of territorial moral statutes by cohabiting with a Native American woman outside the bonds of marriage." Thomas felt his jaw clench at the formal language being used to describe what amounted to basic human kindness. "Captain, these women are my guests. They've committed no crimes and harmed no one." "That," Thornfield said coldly, "is not for you to determine. The larger woman," he gestured dismissively toward Ayanna, "has been practicing medicine without a license, treating white citizens with unregulated Indian remedies. Such practices pose a public health threat and violate territorial medical statutes." Ayanna stepped forward, her massive frame moving with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark. "Captain Thornfield, I am Ayanna Crowfeather, trained in the healing arts by my grandmother and her grandmother before her. The people I have treated came to me willingly, seeking help for conditions that conventional medicine had failed to cure." Miss ... double quotes. Thornfield paused, clearly struggling with her name. "Your tribal registration is irrelevant. Federal law requires all Indians to reside on designated reservations unless specifically authorized otherwise. You have no such authorization." "I am a free citizen of this territory," Ayanna replied calmly. "I have broken no laws. You are a ward of the federal government, as are all Indians," Thornfield corrected sharply. "Your proper place is on the reservation with your own kind, not corrupting white citizens with primitive superstitions." Kiona spoke up for the first time, her voice carrying the steel of youth and righteous anger. "Primitive superstitions? Captain, my cousin has healed more people in the past month than your Dr. Whitfield has helped in the past year. Perhaps you should ask Pete Henley about primitive superstitions, or Mary Patterson, or Jim Crawford." Thornfield's face reddened at being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath his notice. "Young woman, you will speak when spoken to. This is a matter for the courts and the proper authorities, not for children." "Children?" Kiona's hand moved again toward her knife, but Ayanna placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Captain," Thomas interjected, recognizing the dangerous turn the conversation was taking, "what exactly are you here to do?" Thornfield straightened to his full height, clearly relishing the moment. "I am here to place both Indian women under arrest and escort them to the reservation, where they will be held pending a full investigation into their illegal activities. You, Mr. McKinnon, will face charges of harboring fugitive Indians and operating an unlicensed medical facility." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd known this confrontation was coming, but the reality of it, armed soldiers preparing to arrest the woman he loved for the crime of healing people, filled him with a rage so pure was almost blinding. "You'll arrest them over my dead body," he said quietly, but his voice carried the unmistakable promise of violence. Several of the mounted soldiers shifted nervously, hands moving toward their weapons. They'd clearly been told this might not be a peaceful arrest. "Mr. McKinnon," Thornfield said with cold satisfaction. Threatening a federal officer is a serious crime. I advise you to step aside and allow us to perform our duty. Your duty? Thomas's voice rose despite his efforts to control it. Your duty is to protect citizens, not persecute them for showing kindness to fellow human beings. Indians are not citizens, Thornfield replied flatly. They are wards of the state, and this woman is clearly a dangerous influence on you and others in this community. Ayanna stepped between Thomas and the captain, her massive presence somehow managing to diffuse the immediate threat of violence through sheer dignity. Captain Thornfield, she said, her voice carrying the authority of generations of healers, I understand that my presence here disturbs you and others. But before you arrest me for practicing medicine, perhaps you should speak with my patients. Your alleged patients are not relevant to Pete Henley. Ayanna called out suddenly, her voice carrying across the prairie. Thomas turned in surprise to see the old rancher emerging from behind the barn, where he'd apparently been watching the confrontation unfold. Pete Henley was a respected member of the community, a man whose word carried weight even with military authorities. Captain Thornfield, Pete said as he approached, his weathered face grim but determined. I hear you're fixing to arrest Miss Crowfeather here. Mr. Henley, Thornfield replied, clearly uncomfortable with this development. This doesn't concern you. The hell it doesn't, Pete shot back. This woman cured my gout when you're fancy. Doctor couldn't do nothing but give me laudanum and tell me to suffer through it. For the first time in 10 years, I can work with my hands without wanting to scream. Before Thornfield could respond, 2 more figures appeared from different directions. Mary Patterson carrying her healthy baby, and Jim Crawford with his healed hand prominently displayed. You want to arrest the woman who saved my baby's life? Mary demanded, her normally soft voice sharp with indignation. Dr. Whitfield was ready to let my son die rather than admit he didn't know what was wrong. Miss Crowfeather had him breathing normally within hours. Jim Crawford held up his hand, showing pink, healthy skin where an infected wound had nearly cost him his fingers. This woman is a miracle worker, Captain. Arresting her would be like arresting an angel. Thornfield looked around nervously as more people began emerging from various hiding places around the ranch. Apparently, word had spread about the impending arrest, and Ayanna's patients had come to bear witness on her behalf. This is irregular, Thornfield muttered, clearly not having expected community support for the women he'd come to arrest. What's irregular, said a new voice, is threatening to arrest the best healer this territory has seen in 50 years. Everyone turned to see Dr. Samuel Morrison, sheriff, Morrison's brother, and one of the few physicians in the territory with genuine medical training, riding up to join the growing crowd. Double quotes Dr. Morrison, Thornfield said with obvious relief. Finally, a voice of medical reason. Surely you can explain to these people the dangers of unregulated Indian medicine. Dr. Morrison dismounted and walked directly to Ayanna, extending his hand in professional greeting. Miss Crowfeather, I've been hoping to meet you. I've examined several of your patients, and frankly, your success rate puts the rest of us to shame. Thornfield's mouth fell open. Doctor, surely you're not endorsing. Captain, I'm endorsing effective medicine, regardless of its source, Dr. Morrison interrupted. This woman has knowledge that our medical schools don't teach, skills that our textbooks don't contain. Arresting her would be like burning down a library. The captain looked around at the growing crowd of supporters, clearly realizing that his simple arrest mission had become a public relations disaster. But military training and bureaucratic stubbornness wouldn't allow him to back down completely. These testimonials don't change the legal reality, he said stiffly. Federal law is federal law. These women must return to the reservation. Then change the law, Thomas said firmly. Because we're not going anywhere. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, armed soldiers facing determined civilians, while the two women at the center of the conflict stood with quiet dignity, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd touched and healed. In that moment, Ayanna made a decision that would change everything. "Captain Thornfield," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "I challenge your authority to arrest me." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see how this remarkable woman would dare to challenge the full might of territorial authority. "On what grounds?" Thornfield demanded. Ayanna smiled, and there was something ancient and powerful in that expression, something that spoke of peoples who had faced impossible odds and found ways to survive and thrive. "On the grounds that I am no longer just Ayanna, Crow Feather of the Comanche Nation," she said firmly. "As of this moment, I am Ayanna McKinnon, wife of Thomas McKinnon, and a legal citizen of this territory with all the rights and protections that entails." Thomas stared at her in shock, his heart hammering as he realized what she was proposing. Around them, the crowd began to murmur with excitement and approval. "Thomas McKinnon," Ayanna said, turning to face him with love and determination shining in her dark eyes. "Will you marry me right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled authorities represented, their prejudices, their laws, their narrow definitions of who deserved love and protection. Thomas looked at this incredible woman who had just turned her arrest into a wedding proposal, and his answer came without hesitation. "Yes," he said, his voice ringing clear across the prairie. "Yes, I will." The storm was about to break, but it would break over a married couple with the full support of their community. And that changed everything. The silence that followed. Ayanna's marriage proposal seemed to stretch across the entire Oklahoma territory. Captain Thornfield's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, anger, and a dawning realization that his carefully planned arrest had just become infinitely more complicated. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, his military composure cracking. "You cannot simply declare yourself married to avoid federal jurisdiction." "Actually, Captain," Dr. Samuel Morrison said with barely concealed satisfaction, "territorial law allows for common law marriage declarations in the presence of sufficient witnesses. Given that we have approximately 30 people here, I'd say that requirement is more than met." Thomas stepped forward, his hand finding Ayanna's massive one and intertwining their fingers. The simple gesture sent a murmur of approval through the assembled crowd, and he could see several of the soldiers shifting uncomfortably on their horses. "However," Dr. Morrison continued, "to make this absolutely legal and unquestionable, we would need an ordained minister to perform the ceremony." As if summoned by the need itself, another horse and rider appeared on the horizon, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. As the figure drew closer, Thomas recognized the distinctive black clothing and the gentle demeanor of Reverend Samuel Hutchins, the Methodist circuit preacher who served the scattered communities of the territory. "Reverend Hutchins," Pete Henley called out. "Perfect timing, as always." The elderly minister dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones had been rattled by too many miles of hard riding. His weathered face took in the scene-armed soldiers, nervous civilians, and two people holding hands in the center of it all, with the keen understanding of someone who had witnessed every variety of human drama. "Mr. McKinnon, Miss Crow Feather," he said with a slight bow. "I received word that my services might be needed here today, though I confess the message was somewhat unclear about the exact nature of the emergency." Captain Thornfield stepped forward, his military bearing restored by the presence of what he clearly considered a reasonable authority figure. "Reverend, these people are attempting to circumvent federal law through a sham marriage. I trust you won't participate in such deception." Reverend Hutchins studied the captain with eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize bureaucratic bullying when he encountered it. "Captain, are you suggesting that I'm not qualified to determine the sincerity of a couple's desire to wed? I'm suggesting that this entire situation is a legal maneuver designed to To what? Ayanna interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her power and wasn't afraid to use it. To protect a woman who has spent her life healing others from being arrested for practicing medicine. To allow two people who love each other to remain together. If those are crimes, Captain, then perhaps your laws need examination, not your citizens. Reverend Hutchins looked between Thomas and Ayanna, his experienced eyes taking in the obvious affection between them. The way they stood together as a united front. The protective way Thomas positioned himself slightly in front of her, despite her size advantage. Mr. McKinnon, the minister said quietly, do you take this woman as your wife of your own free will, understanding the responsibilities and commitments that marriage entails? I do, Thomas replied without hesitation, his voice carrying across the gathering like a declaration of war against prejudice itself. Miss Crowfeather, Reverend Hutchins continued, do you take this man as your husband, understanding that marriage is a sacred covenant not to be entered into lightly? I do, Ayanna said, and though her voice was soft, it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Captain Thornfield made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Reverend, you cannot seriously be considering marrying a white man to an Indian squaw in violation of. The collective gasp from the crowd at his use of the derogatory term was audible, but it was Kiona who responded with the swift fury of a protective sister. You will not use that word in reference to my cousin, she said, her hand now openly resting on her knife handle. Ayanna Crowfeather is a healer, a medicine woman, and a daughter of chiefs. She has more honor in her smallest finger than you have in your entire uniformed body. Several of the soldiers looked increasingly uncomfortable with their captain's behavior, and Thomas could see that the sympathy of even the military men was shifting toward Ayanna. Reverend Hutchins raised his hand for silence, his expression grave but determined. Captain Thornfield, in all my years of ministry, I have never seen God's face more clearly than in acts of love that transcend human prejudice. If you have legal objections to this union, you can pursue them through proper channels after the ceremony, but you will not prevent me from joining two souls who have found healing in each other. The minister opened his worn Bible and began to speak in the clear, carrying voice of someone accustomed to preaching in open fields and crowded saloons. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Thomas McKinnon and Ayanna Crowfeather in holy matrimony. Marriage is an institution ordained by God, sanctified by love, and honored by commitment. As the familiar words of the marriage ceremony began, something remarkable happened. The tension that had been building toward violence began to transform into something else entirely. Mary Patterson stepped forward with wildflowers hastily gathered from the prairie. Jim Crawford began humming a wedding march, his voice soon joined by others. Even some of the younger soldiers seemed caught up in the unexpected beauty of the moment. Thomas, Reverend Hutchins continued, do you promise to love, honor, and cherish Ayanna, in sickness and in health, in poverty and prosperity, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. And I promise to protect her from anyone who would harm her, to support her gifts as a healer, and to build with her a home where love matters more than the opinions of small-minded people. The addition of his own vows brought tears to several eyes in the crowd, and even Captain Thornfield seemed momentarily affected by the obvious sincerity of the moment. Ayanna, the minister said, do you promise to love, honor, and cherish Thomas, in sickness and in health, in poverty and prosperity, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Ayanna replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. And I promise to heal not just his body, but his heart, to share with him the wisdom of my people, and to prove that love is the greatest medicine of all. Dr. Morrison stepped forward suddenly, pulling a simple gold band from his own finger. For the bride, he said with a smile. Every wedding needs rings. Pete Henley, not to be outdone, removed his own wedding band worn smooth by decades of faithful marriage. Offered it to Thomas. Martha would have wanted this, he said simply. As Thomas slipped the oversized ring onto Ayana's finger, adjusting it to fit her massive hand, Captain Thornfield made one final attempt to stop the proceedings. "This is illegal," he shouted. "Territorial law prohibits marriage between whites and Indians." "Actually, Captain," Dr. Morrison said with obvious satisfaction, "you're thinking of the anti-miscegenation laws that some states have adopted. Oklahoma Territory has no such statute. Mixed marriages are perfectly legal here." The captain's face went purple with frustrated rage, but before he could respond, Reverend Hutchins's voice rang out with final authority. "By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Oklahoma, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was gentle, reverent, and utterly transformative. As Thomas's lips met Ayana's, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to echo across the entire prairie. Even several of the soldiers were smiling, caught up in the joy of the moment despite their orders. When they finally separated, Ayana was crying not tears of sorrow, but tears of a woman who had thought herself unworthy of love and had just been proven magnificently wrong in front of 30 witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Hutchins announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Thomas McKinnon." The celebration that followed was unlike anything the Oklahoma Territory had ever seen. Someone produced a fiddle, others contributed food from their saddlebags, and within minutes an impromptu wedding reception was taking place on the McKinnon Ranch, complete with dancing, singing, and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing love triumph over hatred. Captain Thornfield stood apart from the festivities, clearly at a loss for how to proceed. His arrest warrants were now legally meaningless. Ayana was no longer a fugitive Indian but a married citizen with full legal protections. His soldiers were beginning to enjoy the celebration despite themselves, and his authority seemed to be evaporating like morning mist. Kiona approached him with a cup of cool water and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Captain," she said sweetly, "you look thirsty and confused. Perhaps you should return to your superiors and explain that the situation has been resolved." The captain took the water, but fixed her with a hostile stare. "This isn't over, girl. There are other laws, other ways to deal with troublemakers." "Perhaps," Kiona replied, her smile never wavering, "but today, love won. And sometimes, Captain, that's enough to change everything." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Thomas and Ayana found themselves standing together on their porch, watching their friends and neighbors dance in their front yard. The woman who had been abandoned to die alone in the wilderness was now surrounded by a community that had rallied to defend her, married to a man who saw her true worth, and legally protected from those who would persecute her. "Mrs. McKinnon," Thomas said softly, testing the sound of her new name. "I like how that sounds," Ayana replied, leaning against his shoulder despite the difference in their sizes. "What happens now?" he asked. This was a victory that Thornfield was right about. "One thing, this isn't over." Ayana looked out over the celebrating crowd, at Kiona teaching some of the children a traditional Comanche dance, at Dr. Morrison earnestly discussing herbal remedies with Pete Henley, at a community that had been transformed by love and healing. "Now," she said with quiet confidence, "we build something beautiful. We heal whoever needs healing, we love whoever needs loving, and we prove that different kinds of people can not only coexist, but thrive together." She paused, then smiled with the radiance of a woman who had finally found her true home. "Now, my husband, we show the world what a palace of love really looks like." As the sun began to set over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the celebration continued. But Thomas and Ayana both knew that their real work was just beginning. They had won this battle, but the war for acceptance, understanding, and the right to love freely would continue. Fortunately, they would fight it together as husband and wife, as healers, and as proof that love truly is the greatest medicine of all. 6 months after their impromptu wedding, the McKinnon Ranch had become something unprecedented in Oklahoma Territory, a place where two worlds merged into something entirely new and beautiful. What had begun as a desperate legal maneuver had blossomed into a marriage that defied every expectation and challenged every prejudice. The transformation was visible everywhere. The house itself had grown, with Thomas adding a large wing specifically designed to accommodate Ayanna's healing practice. The new addition featured wide doorways, reinforced floors, and specially built furniture that could support her substantial frame while maintaining the dignity and comfort she deserved. But more than the physical changes, the ranch had become a beacon of hope for people from all walks of life. On this particular morning in early spring, the sound of hammering echoed across the prairie as Thomas worked on the final details of what Ayanna had dubbed her healing sanctuary. The large room would serve as both a treatment space for patients and a teaching area, where she could pass on her knowledge to others interested in traditional medicine. Higher on the left, Ayanna called out from below, her expert eye ensuring that the shelving would be perfectly level for her extensive collection of medicinal herbs and preparations. Thomas adjusted the wooden shelf and looked down at his wife, marveling as he did every day at the confidence that had replaced the broken despair he'd first encountered. Ayanna moved through her domain with the authority of someone who had found her true calling, directing the construction with the same precision she applied to her healing work. "Perfect," she said with satisfaction. "That will hold the winter preparations beautifully." The sanctuary was nearly complete, and Thomas felt a deep pride in what they had built together. The room was spacious enough to accommodate patients of any size, with multiple treatment areas, a preparation space for medicines, and comfortable seating for consultations. Everything had been designed with Ayanna's specific needs in mind, but also with an eye toward creating a space that would feel welcoming to anyone who entered seeking help. "Mrs. McKinnon," called a voice from outside, and they both turned to see young Billy Patterson, Mary's eldest son, standing in the doorway with barely contained excitement. "What is it, Billy?" Ayanna asked, setting down the bundle of dried sage she'd been organizing. "There's a whole caravan coming up the road," Billy said breathlessly. "Must be 20 wagons, maybe more, and they're flying a medical flag." Thomas and Ayanna exchanged glances. Word of Ayanna's healing abilities had spread far beyond their local community over the past months, bringing visitors from as far away as Kansas and Texas. But a caravan of 20 wagons suggested something much larger than the usual stream of individual patients. They stepped outside to see an impressive procession making its way across the prairie toward their ranch. The lead wagon bore the insignia of the Territorial Medical College, and Thomas could make out several figures in formal academic dress despite the dusty journey. "Academic delegation," Thomas observed. "This should be interesting." As the caravan drew closer, they could see that it included not just medical professionals, but also what appeared to be government officials, reporters, and even some tribal representatives. This was clearly not a casual visit. The lead wagon came to a stop in front of their house, and a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and an expensive suit climbed down with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to frontier travel. He was followed by a younger man carrying a leather satchel and several notebooks. "Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon," the older man said, approaching with the measured courtesy of someone making an official call. "I am Dr. Harrison Blackwood, Dean of the Territorial Medical College. This is my associate, Dr. James Whitmore, and we've brought with us a delegation representing various medical and governmental institutions." Thomas stepped forward, his protective instincts automatically engaging. "Gentlemen, what brings such an impressive group to our ranch?" Dr. Blackwood smiled, and there was genuine warmth in his expression. Mrs. McKinnon's reputation as a healer has reached far beyond Oklahoma territory, we've come to learn. Ayanna moved to stand beside Thomas, her presence filling the space with quiet dignity. Learn what, exactly, Dr. Blackwood? Everything, Dr. Whitmore said eagerly, his youth and enthusiasm evident in every word. Your success rates, your methodologies, your pharmacological knowledge, Mrs. McKinnon, you're curing conditions that our best physicians struggle with. We'd like to understand how. Over the next hour, as the delegation settled into a makeshift camp on their property, the scope of their mission became clear. Word of Ayanna's healing abilities had reached the highest levels of territorial medical and governmental authority. Rather than viewing her as a threat to be eliminated, some forward-thinking officials had recognized her as a resource to be studied and celebrated. Mrs. McKinnon, Dr. Blackwood explained as they sat in the newly completed healing sanctuary, we've documented over 200 successful treatments attributed to your care. Your success rate with respiratory ailments alone exceeds anything we've achieved with conventional medicine. Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. Respiratory problems often stem from imbalances that conventional medicine doesn't address. The body, mind, and spirit must all be treated together. Dr. Whitmore scribbled frantically in his notebook. Could you elaborate on that? What specific imbalances do you identify, and how do you address them? What followed was the most extraordinary medical conference ever held on the Oklahoma frontier. Ayanna spent hours explaining her diagnostic techniques, her understanding of the relationships between different body systems, and her methods for preparing medicines from native plants. The visiting physicians asked detailed questions, took extensive notes, and observed with growing amazement as she demonstrated her skills on several patients who had sought her help, but the delegation had brought more than academic interest. Dr. Blackwood produced an official-looking document from his satchel and presented it to Ayanna with obvious pride. Mrs. McKinnon, by unanimous vote of the Territorial Medical Board, and with the approval of the Governor's office, you are hereby granted the first-ever license to practice traditional medicine in Oklahoma Territory. This license recognizes your expertise in herbal medicine, diagnostic techniques, and holistic healing approaches. Ayanna stared at the document in disbelief. A license? But I thought... Dr. Whitfield said. Dr. Whitfield, Dr. Blackwood said with obvious distaste, was operating from personal prejudice rather than professional judgment. His opposition to your work has been noted and addressed. Thomas felt a surge of pride and vindication as he watched his wife accept the recognition she had always deserved. But the delegation had even more surprises in store. Additionally, Dr. Whitmore continued, the medical college would like to offer you a position as professor of traditional medicine. You would teach our students about native healing techniques while continuing your practice here on the ranch. The offer was unprecedented, a Comanche woman being invited to teach at a white medical institution. Ayanna looked at Thomas, then back at the assembled academics. I would be honored, she said carefully, but I have conditions. Name them. Dr. Blackwood replied immediately. First, my teaching must include the spiritual and cultural aspects of healing, not just the physical techniques. Second, I want Kiona to be accepted as my assistant and eventual successor. Third, this sanctuary must remain here on the ranch, accessible to anyone who needs healing regardless of their ability to pay. The doctors conferred briefly among themselves before Dr. Blackwood nodded, agreed to all conditions. In fact, your commitment to accessibility is part of what convinced the board to support this arrangement. As the day progressed, more revelations emerged. The government officials in the delegation announced that the McKinnon Ranch would be designated as the territory's first official center for traditional medicine research. Funding would be provided to expand the facilities, and Ayanna would be given authority to train and certify other traditional healers. You're creating something entirely new, explained Commissioner Robert Hayes, the territorial official overseeing health policy. A bridge between traditional and modern medicine that could revolutionize healthcare throughout the frontier. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when the tribal representatives, leaders from several different nations, including the Comanche, Cherokee, and Choctaw, presented Ayanna with a beautiful ceremonial pipe and spoke of her as a healer who honored the traditions of all peoples. "You have shown that the old ways and the new ways can work together," said Chief Standing Bear of the Cherokee delegation. "You have brought honor to all our nations." That evening, as the delegation prepared to return to their various institutions, Thomas and Ayanna stood together in their sanctuary, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the evidence of her growing influence. "A year ago, I was abandoned in the wilderness, considered worthless by the world," Ayanna said softly. "Now I'm a licensed physician and a professor. How did this happen?" Thomas smiled, wrapping his arms around her substantial waist. "It happened because you never stopped being who you truly are. You just needed someone to see you clearly. And you needed someone to help you remember how to live again," she replied, leaning into his embrace. Through the window, they could see the lights of the delegation's camp, where academic discussions about traditional medicine continued well into the night. Tomorrow, those learned men and women would return to their institutions and begin the work of integrating Ayanna's knowledge into formal medical training. But tonight, in the sanctuary they had built together, two people who had found healing in each other's love looked forward to a future filled with possibilities they could never have imagined. "Thomas," Ayanna said quietly, "I think we really have built a palace of love." "The most beautiful one I've ever seen," he replied, and meant it with all his heart. Outside, the Oklahoma wind carried the scent of growing things across the prairie. And somewhere in the distance, a nightbird sang a song of hope and renewal. The palace of love was complete, but its work was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patience, new opportunities to prove that love and healing could triumph over prejudice and fear. For tonight, that was enough. 2 years after that first delegation's visit, the McKinnon Ranch had evolved into something that defied every expectation of what a frontier settlement could become. The Ayanna McKinnon Center for Traditional Medicine now sprawled across 50 acres, featuring multiple healing lodges, teaching facilities, research gardens, and dormitories for students who came from across the continent to learn. But on this crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves danced on the Oklahoma wind, the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the buildings or the reputation. It was in the woman who stood before a gathering unlike any the territory had ever seen. Ayanna McKinnon, now acknowledged as the foremost authority on traditional medicine in North America, addressed an audience of over 300 people assembled for the first annual conference on integrated healing. The crowd included physicians from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, tribal healers from dozens of nations, government officials from Washington, D.C., and patients whose lives had been transformed by her care. 5 years ago, Ayanna began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, I was abandoned in the wilderness, told I was too much, too big, too different, too costly to deserve love or care. Today, I stand before you not in spite of who I am, but because of who I am. Thomas watched from the side of the speaking platform, his heart swelling with pride at the commanding presence his wife had become. The broken woman he'd found weeping by that dried creek bed had evolved into a force of nature, a healer, teacher, and living bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilably different. In our Comanche tradition, Ayanna continued, we believe that everything happens for a purpose, even the most painful experiences. My abandonment led me to a man who saw my worth when I had forgotten it myself. My suffering taught me to recognize and ease the suffering of others. My sighs, which the world called a burden, became my strength, allowing me to carry the hopes and healing of many people." In the audience, familiar faces nodded in understanding. Pete Henley, now completely free of the gout that had plagued him for decades, sat beside Mary Patterson, whose youngest child had been successfully treated for a rare respiratory condition that conventional medicine had declared hopeless. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who had become Ayanna's closest collaborator in developing integrated treatment protocols, beamed with professional pride, but it was the presence of Jonathan Hargrove that created a stir of whispered conversations throughout the crowd. Ayanna's former husband had arrived unexpectedly that morning, travel-worn and clearly nervous, carrying himself with the defeated posture of a man who had spent years regretting the worst decision of his life. Thomas had wanted to turn him away immediately, but Ayanna had insisted they hear what he had to say. "Mrs. McKinnon," Jonathan had said, unable to meet her eyes, I need to tell you ... "What, Jonathan?" Ayanna had replied with the calm dignity that had become her trademark. "What do you need to tell me? That I was wrong. That I was a fool and a coward. That abandoning you was the worst thing I've ever done, and I've spent every day since then knowing it." Thomas had stepped forward protectively, but Ayanna had placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I know," she had said simply. "But your regret doesn't undo what you did. It just means you've finally learned to see clearly." Now, as Ayanna continued her keynote address, Jonathan sat in the back of the assembly, a broken man witnessing the triumph of the woman he had discarded like refuse. "The palace of love that my husband and I have built here," Ayanna said, gesturing toward the sprawling complex around them, "was never about the buildings or the recognition. It was about creating a place where healing could happen, not just of bodies, but of hearts, minds, and spirits." She paused, her eyes finding Thomas in the crowd, and the love that passed between them was so palpable that several people in the audience wiped away tears. Love, true love, doesn't ask you to become smaller to make others comfortable. True love sees your vastness, physical, spiritual, intellectual, and celebrates it. True love builds palaces where your gifts can flourish. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, who had become not just a colleague but a dear friend, stepped forward as Ayanna concluded her speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to announce that the Territorial Medical College, in partnership with the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Smithsonian Institution, will be establishing the Ayanna McKinnon Institute for Traditional Medicine as a permanent research and teaching facility." The applause was thunderous, but Ayanna raised her hand for silence. "I accept this honor not for myself, but for my grandmother and all the healers who came before her. For Kiona, who carries the tradition forward. For my husband, who proved that love recognizes no boundaries. And for every person who has ever been told they are too much, too different, too difficult to deserve dignity and respect." As the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowd began to disperse for the evening feast, Thomas found himself alone with Ayanna in the original healing sanctuary, where this journey had truly begun. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked, settling beside her on the specially reinforced bench they'd built together. "Which day?" she replied with a smile. "The day I found you by the creek, when you were convinced you were nothing." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on his. "I think about how broken I was. How sure I was that my story was over. How I thought being abandoned meant I was worthless. And now? Now I understand that being abandoned was the beginning of my real story, not the end. Jonathan thought he was throwing me away, but he was actually setting me free to become who I was meant to be." Through the window, they could see the evening's activities beginning. Kiona was leading a group of medical students in a traditional blessing ceremony. Dr. Morrison was deep in conversation with a tribal healer from the Apache Nation about respiratory treatments. Children from the local school were playing games taught to them by visiting Cherokee educators. Look at what we've built, Thomas said wonderingly. This place, this community, this new way of thinking about medicine and healing. We didn't build it alone, Ayana reminded him. Every person who chose acceptance over prejudice, every patient who trusted traditional medicine, every doctor willing to learn from a Comanche woman, they all helped build this palace. A soft knock on the door interrupted their reflection. Kiona entered, followed by a young woman Thomas didn't recognize, tall, thin, with the bearing of someone who had traveled far and carried heavy burdens. Ayana, Kiona said gently, there's someone here who needs healing. The young woman stepped forward hesitantly. Mrs. McKinnon, my name is Sarah Whitman. I've traveled from Ohio because the doctors there say there's nothing more they can do for my son. He's dying, and you're my last hope. Ayana rose immediately, her healer's instincts engaging. Where is your son now? In the wagon outside. He's very sick. Without hesitation, Ayana moved toward the door. Bring him in. Thomas, help me prepare the treatment room. Kiona, gather the fever-breaking herbs. As they sprang into action, Thomas marveled at how naturally this had all become. The palace of love they'd built wasn't just about their own healing. It was about creating a place where healing could happen for anyone who needed it. 2 hours later, after Ayana had examined the fevered child and begun treatment with a complex combination of traditional medicines and modern techniques, Sarah Whitman sat in the sanctuary with tears streaming down her face. He's breathing easier already, she whispered. How is that possible? Because, Ayana said gently, healing isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about treating the whole person, body, mind, and spirit together. As the night deepened and the child's fever began to break, Thomas stood on the porch of their home, looking out over the complex they'd built together. Lights glowed in windows throughout the settlement, each one representing lives being touched, healed, and transformed. Ayana joined him, her massive frame silhouetted against the warm lights spilling from their doorway. Do you regret any of it? She asked quietly. The controversy, the challenges, the way our life turned out so differently from what you'd planned? Thomas turned to look at his wife, this incredible woman who had transformed from an abandoned refugee into one of the most respected healers in North America. Her size, which the world had once seen as a burden, now seemed to him like a physical manifestation of the vastness of her spirit, the enormity of her capacity for love and healing. Regret? He said, pulling her close. Ayana, you didn't interrupt my life, you saved it. You didn't burden me, you freed me. You showed me that love isn't about finding someone who fits into your existing world. It's about building a new world big enough for both of your dreams. She leaned into his embrace, and they stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their thriving community settling into sleep. The palace is complete, Ayana said softly. No, Thomas replied, kissing the top of her head. The palace will never be complete. It will keep growing, keep healing, keep proving that love builds something bigger and more beautiful than hate could ever tear down. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, and somewhere in the medical lodge, a child's fever broke completely, his breathing returning to the easy rhythm of healthy sleep. The palace of love lived and breathed and healed, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And in a small cemetery in town, on a grave marked Martha McKinnon, beloved wife, fresh wildflowers had been placed with a note that read, "Thank you for teaching him how to love completely. Your garden still blooms. Ayana." The story that had begun with abandonment and despair had become a legacy of love, healing, and hope that would continue for generations to come. The 500-pound Comanche woman who had once been thrown away like refuse had become the cornerstone of a palace that proved love could triumph over any obstacle, heal any wound, and transform any life. The palace of love was complete, and its doors would remain open forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.